Welcome to World Chess Championship game number 9, Gukesh with the white pieces. We have d4 by Gukesh, knight to f6, pawn c4, e6, and pawn g3. This system is called the Catalan setup with white, bishop to b4 check, and bishop d2, and bishop to e7. The point of this maneuver of giving a check and then going back is to misplace the bishop on d2. The d2 square can be used for the queen to exert some pressure on the d-file, maybe to support the advanced e5. As well, maybe the knight can get to d2 supporting the advance on e4. So the bishop is slightly misplaced on d2. After bishop g2, we have pawn d5, knight f3, castles, and castles. Okay, something to mention is that Ding is a well-known Catalan player with the white pieces. So he's going into this position where Ding, playing with the white, has a lot of comfortability, a lot of wins, a lot of draws, and a very solid setup for white here. So I'm curious to see what Ding's setup is. Is he going to play some open Catalan with d takes e4, or is he going to play the close Catalan with pawn to c6? Ding opts for c6, and we have the closed Catalan. The key themes of this structure is that white has a space advantage with two pawns in the center. If black ever captures, then we can transition to the open system. In this case, with a pawn on c6, it might happen anyways. And the reason for that is with the pawn on c6, after you take and queen c2, the pawn can be defended with pawn to b5, and this diagonal is closed. There's a lot of details about this Catalan structure. I employ it when I play as white in many tournament games. In terms of white's plans here, white is aiming for the ideal move pawn to e4 to try to break down black's grip on the light squares, potentially take once and play e5, or take the other way, depending on circumstances, and play c5. White's general play is to push e5, grabbing space and open up this diagonal. From black's point of view, black has the problem of the light squared bishop. So black's aiming to play moves like b6 and bishop a6, or b6, bishop e7, and trying to play along this diagonal. Let's see what happens in the game. We have queen c2, knight to d7, rook to d1, pawn to b6, and bishop c3. Bishop c3, I'm not as familiar with this move, but the idea is very consistent with white's main plan to play knight e2 and play pawn to e4. After bishop to b7, you cannot take the pawn on c4 even though the queen is not guarding it because of this move knight to e5. And the knight and the bishop work well together to hit this pawn on c6 and the pawn on c4. Now you might ask what happens if the knight takes. Well, then black will be in kind of a big trouble here because the rook is hitting the queen and the pawn is hitting the knight. You have to play knight e7 and you lose the pawn on c6. If you play pawn to knight to d5, then you have pawn to e4 winning the piece. So Ding plays the move bishop to b7, not taking the pawn on c4. We have knight to d2, queen c7, rook to c1, rook to d8, and I really thought e4 was going to be played here. It seems like the most natural move, but Gukesh opts for the move pawn b4, playing maybe for this c5 move. And I was asking, what's the reason he wouldn't play e4 in this position? Well, typically, when you play the move e4, the queen is not guarding the bishop on b7, which makes it impossible for black to play c5. For example, after e4, takes, 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 black can easily equalize the game with the move pawn c5, activating the bishop, and the queen defends the bishop on b7. But if the queen is not on c7, and let's say black plays like rook e8, and we have e4, then after takes, 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 black cannot play this move c5. And if they try to, let's say, defend the bishop, maybe we can come up with some way to stop this move c5, and I think we can actually by playing, I think, maybe queen to e2. And the idea is that we're putting pressure on the queen here. I'm not 100% sure if this works or not. We can play maybe d5 as well here, but the point is that the bishop on b7 is defended. So queen c7, e4 is not played, but Gukesh goes for b4, and b4 is the best move according to the engine in this position. After pawn c5, we have captures, and queen b2. This transformation of structures is asking a question whether or not white can get some edge out of the opening. I think a typical pawn trade that could happen is to take with the d pawn, and after black takes back, then push the pawn to b5, with the idea of having a 2 versus 1 pawn majority on the queen side. The problem in this position is that if you go for this setup, black can play the move d4, shutting out the bishop, and at the same time activating their bishop on this diagonal. So it didn't quite work for white, and that's unfortunate for Gukesh. After takes, queen b2, the idea of putting some pressure along this diagonal, and also the b7 bishop in case this opens up, we have the move knight to b6. Gukesh plays a bishop to a5. We have pawn takes on c4, knight takes on c4, and this is a critical moment in the game. Ting has to be able to solve this problem tactically because white is threatening to take and win pawn and also skewer the queen and the rook. So from black's perspective, he has to solve this problem tactically. This is a critical moment in the game. If you want, you can pause the video here and try to figure out the most precise way for black to play. Okay, welcome back. Dean played the move bishop takes on f3. And we should note that there's some difference between knight takes on c4 and then bishop takes, or bishop takes first. So let's examine knight takes. If knight takes on c4, white cannot, actually white can recapture here because of exactly the reason why the bishop is on b7 is that if the queen takes on a5, we can take on b7, restoring material. If bishop takes on f3 first, then after, let's say bishop takes back, now black can play the move knight takes on c4. The reason for this is that if the rook were to capture on c4, then the queen can take on a5, and after this capture on a8, rook takes on a8, we have two minor pieces against the two rooks, plus a rook for black, and this favors black. As a general rule, the two minor pieces favor two pieces are better than a rook in most cases. So this is one variation, and we should also mention that after knight takes, the bishop can take the queen on t7. But the problem is after bishop takes, knight takes, bishop takes, and rook takes, again we have a situation where black has two minor pieces, two bishops are on the board, and rook for rook, and black has these two minor pieces for the rook, and black is much better here. The engine actually says black is close to winning. So in the game, after knight takes on c4, the bishop captured on f3 so that the queen cannot capture on b7 after those variations. Bishop takes on f3, and now bishop takes on b6. An important move because, again, after bishop takes on f3, we have knight takes on c4, attacking the queen and attacking the bishop. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and bishop takes back, and rook to a6. So there was some transformation, some trades occurred, and what is happening now in this position? We have bishops of opposite color. The b6 pawn is weak, and the a2 pawn is weak. White will aim to target the b6 pawn and try to overprotect the pawn on a2. In the game, Gukesh played the move queen to b5. This was not the top engine choice here. Queen b5 improves the queen, attacks the rook, but it gives up the pawn on a2. The best move here was the move knight to e5, trying to head into the c6 square. In the game, queen to b5 was played. We have rook takes, knight takes, and queen to a7. We have queen to b1. Black has some problems on the back row, as we'll see in a moment. After rook to b8, pawn takes on c5. Gukesh finds a way to win a pawn even though the knight is hanging because of some back row problems. So for example, if you were to take this, undermining the knight, then after rook takes, queen takes or rook takes, Now we have queen takes, rook takes, and rook c8 winning the game, or rook d8 winning the game as well. So after queen to b1, Gukesh is setting up a potential threat to win the pawn, and black is struggling um, to solve this problem. Now you might ask, what happens if pawn takes on d4? So if pawn takes on d4, black is solving the problem of his pawn, but now the c file is open, and white has a very clever move here, knight to c8. The rook defends the knight, and the queen very importantly attacks the rook. That's why queen d1 was played. The queen has to defend the rook, but the queen is under attack. So if the queen tries to defend the bishop and the rook at the same time, now we have the move knight to e7, winning a full piece. And if queen takes on e7, then there's queen takes on a2. So this is why Gukesh played queen b1, and this is also why Liren did not take on d4. After pawn takes on c5, we have rook to a6, queen to b5, and now the bishop can take on c5. The difference is that in this position, after queen takes, we can take with the rook on a6 rather than the rook that's on the back row. After rook takes, rook c6, we get a trade, and we have a completely objectively equal position. We've reached the endgame where we have 4 pawns on the same side of the board with a difference of knight versus bishop. As a general rule, the knight is better in these endgames with pawns on a single side of the board, but the bishop is extremely strong, and white should have absolutely no problems here at all. After king g2, we have rook to b2, king f1, king g7, h3, h5, rook a1, rook c2, bishop b5, rook c5, bishop d3, knight to d7, pawn to f4. Takes, takes. The pawn structure has changed. The h5 pawn is weak, and white has the potential to create a pass pawn on the maybe on the e file. I don't see it possible here. I think it's actually just completely symmetrical now that I look just one more second further. Okay, after rook c3, we have king to f2, knight to c5, king to e3, knight takes, pawn takes, and you have to take with the pawn here. You cannot take with the king, so you have to take with the pawn, and the pawns are a little bit disrupted. Now white does have the potential to get a pass pawn on the d file, but it's not going to happen when there's pressure on the third rank here. Rook c2, king f3, rook d2, rook to a3, defending the pawn, king g6, rook b3, and we get a few more moves, some captures, and the game ends in a draw after this capture. Even though black is up a pawn here, the king is stopping the pawn from ever becoming a queen. The king will always sit in the corner. So after king f6, just giving away the pawn, Gukesh captures it, and the game is a draw. A very interesting match, and a very interesting opening choice by Gukesh to go into the Catalan, which is what Ding loves to play with the white pieces. So game number 9 is a draw. We'll see what happens in the next round. The game is getting closer and closer to getting to tie breaks, and the question is Gukesh still the favorite? I think after this last match, we can no longer say that Gukesh is the favorite in this match. It is clear that Ding is holding his positions. It looks like he's satisfied with playing a draw, but unless you can beat him, the games will just end in a draw, and it could be a 50-50 in the time scrambles when we get into those tie breaks. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you in the next recap.